Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming along this Saturday afternoon to our June lecture. As you would have seen on our social media site, or on the website, or Reconnaissance, we are very, very fortunate to have both Adrian and Gary here to present their talk on an element of Kokoda. This afternoon, you'll be hearing the guys talk about the 2nd 27th, a story not as popular as the 14th or the 16th battalions, but as you can see, as you'll find out this afternoon, as important in stopping the Japanese at Mission Ridge. So I'll hand over to Adrian, and thank you so much for being here.
Pleasure. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak today. Probably in some ways I should say good evening, because if I spoke about the 2nd 27th Battalion in all detail, it would take us that long. So I'm going to simply attempt to give you a summary in the hour that we have together, and hopefully leaving some time at the end for questions. As you can probably see by the hair of my chinny chin chin, I am not a military man, nor the son of a military man. However, I am the grandson of a military man, Private Percy James Clack, NX 194756, 2nd 9th Battalion AIF. And I am the great nephew of a survivor of the Thai-Burma Railway, Private Donald Mackenzie, 2nd 30th Battalion. It was these men that gave me my interest in military history. Today I'm going to assume a certain amount of knowledge. I apologise if I've either assumed too much, or, as is probably the case, too little, because I recognise that you're a very learned audience. Your interest in military things, it makes this quite challenging. To be honest, it reminds me a little bit of my honeymoon. And I'm going to say the same thing I said to my wife at the time. I'm going to do my very best, but please don't expect too much. The 2nd 27th Battalion, so this here will give us a bit of an idea of the direction we're heading. The 2nd 27th Battalion was formed in May of 1940 as part of the 7th Division. It's a South Australian battalion, and its sister battalions in the 21st Brigade are the 2nd 14th from Victoria, which is a well-known battalion, and the 2nd 16th from Western Australia. In November of 1940, they are deployed to the Middle East. Here we have a well-known general, Major General Tubby Allen, in the foreground, and we have Lieutenant Colonel Moten, the commanding officer of the 2nd 27th, there in Palestine with the men of the 2nd 27th. A lot of their time was spent in training before they went into battle. And here is one of the companies. Now, when it says A company, we don't know if it was A company, B company, or C company, but it was one of the companies. They're doing their bayonet practice. And that particular image will become of interest when we come to the time at Mission Ridge. Early in 1941, the 2nd 27th Battalion began defensive duties in the Western Desert. Then in June and July, they were involved in the campaign in Syria and Lebanon. The British moved into Syria because their fear was that the Germans would use it as a base to attack Egypt. The 7th Division moved into this campaign, and the 2nd 27th fought in the battles at Sidon and Damour. Now, just a little bit of trivia for anyone who used to go to Sunday school. You'll remember that Sidon was the son of Canaan, who was the son of Ham, who was allegedly the son of Noah. So there's a little bit of the background from that. On the 10th of July of 41, the 21st Brigade were about to enter Beirut when the Vichy French surrendered. For the rest of the time in the Middle East, they remained on a variety of duties, but in terms of fighting, essentially their time was finished. As we know, on the 7th of December, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. They moved down the Malay Peninsula, and the situation has suddenly changed. At the start of January of 42, Churchill requests that 2 Australian divisions are returned to the Far East, to Burma. As we know, the 6th and the 7th Division were the ones chosen. Also on the 3rd of January 1942, while this is going on in the Middle East, or the request comes for the troops to return, the 39th Battalion Militia and the 53rd Battalion Militia, they arrive in Port Moresby. The 49th Battalion is already there, so together they become the 30th Brigade and become known as the Mice of Moresby. On the 17th of February, 2 days after the fall of Singapore, Curtin makes a request of Churchill that the Australian troops be returned to Australia. As we know, a bit of a tussle went on between the two, and finally in March, Curtin won and the Australian troops begin to arrive back. The situation to the north of Australia, as we know, is increasingly taut and is becoming desperate. Darwin is bombed, we know, on the 19th of February. HMAS Perth and the USS Houston are sunk in the Sunda Strait on the 1st of March. The Japanese 2nd Battalion of the 144th Regiment, they land between the 8th and the 13th of March at Salamaua and Lae on the northern side of Papua New Guinea. The battles are moving closer to the north of Australia. In Australia, Arthur Key is appointed commander of the 2nd 14th Battalion. Lieutenant Colonel Albert Caro to the 2nd 16th. He was in fact the second in charge in that particular battalion, and his commander was Brigadier Potts, who is promoted to head of the 21st Brigade. The 2nd 27th, though, is a man from South Australia. You know the famous Cooper's Brewing Company? He's one of the family of the famous Coopers. Jeffery Cooper, MBE, is appointed.
We didn't bring any beer, by the way.
No.
He's got a couple of good wing nuts.
Yeah, he's got some good news.
Open those bottles.
The 7th Division are positioned around Brisbane. We know of the Brisbane line, the north of Australia, to be, I guess, surrendered in a sense, below to be defended. In July of 42, Brigadier Potts chooses the Blackhall Range up near Maleny on the Sunshine Coast as what he believes an ideal training ground for the 21st Brigade. And this is an interesting little letter we found, or excerpt from a letter to his wife. He says about the training: the 2nd 16th did over 65 miles in 2 days. The 2nd 14th did 120 miles in 4 days, 9 hours, not too dusty. The 2nd 27th did 80 miles across country, rivers and all, no boats allowed in 3.5 days. So it's just giving you a bit of an idea. These guys are starting to get some serious training while they're back in Australia. Following their return to Australia, in mid-March, the Japanese, or early March actually, they land at Tulagai, which is just north of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. At the same time, an invasion force leaves part from Truk and part from Rabaul and is steaming for Port Moresby. The Battle of the Coral Sea sees the Japanese change their plans. They turn that invasion fleet back and Port Moresby is reprieved for a time. We know then, following the Battle of Midway, which was quite a decisive battle for the Americans, that the Japanese had to change their plans. So following Midway, General Hyakutake is commissioned with a plan to go overland to Port Moresby from the northern side. On the 21st of July 1942 at 2:40 p.m, Buna is shelled and the Japanese begin landing at Basabua, which is near Gona on the northern side of the Owen Stanleys. We know that the 39th Battalion has gone forward and will meet the Japanese invasion force. The 53rd have also gone forward. Meanwhile, in Australia on the 6th of August, the 2nd 14th and the 2nd 16th battalions, they sail for Port Moresby and will arrive there on the 13th of August. On the 8th of August, the 2nd 27th will sail, and they sail on a ship called the Zebulon Brook. It's a cargo ship. When they sailed to the Middle East, they were on the ship called the Aquitania. Now, if you know anything about the Aquitania, it's a sister ship to the Mauretania and the well-known Lusitania. It was actually built to challenge the Titanic and the Britannic, which were larger and much more luxurious ships. So for the 2nd 27th, there was a bit of a come down on their trip to Port Moresby. On that same date, Brigadier Potts and Major Challen arrive in Port Moresby. Basil Morris, the commander in Port Moresby, is not even aware that they're coming. That's how disorganised the situation is. 11th of August, Sidney Rowell, Lieutenant General Sidney Rowell, he arrives in Port Moresby with Major Allen. Rowell takes over New Guinea Force and Basil Morris becomes head of Angao. Discussions are made about supply. Potts and Allen talk to Morris, and Morris promises 2 plane loads of supplies to Myola. Myola, doesn't show it on that map, but you just pointed it out for us, Gary.
So it's right about here.
Yeah. So it's a dry lake bed, an open area, which is just an amazing spot when you've been walking through the jungle day after day. That's going to be a supply base found by Bert Kensel, a local Kokoda man. Both Allen and Potts suggest that a lot of the supplies will be moved forward by their own men, and Basil Morris actually says, look, that's just not doable. The plan is to have 40,000 rations at Myola so that an offensive can occur. The 14th of August, the 2nd 27th, they arrive in Port Moresby. Now, one of the suggestions by Peter Broun, who's a very good historian, is that the 2nd 27th were held back in order, well, as the situation in Milne Bay was building up, and so they were held back. But the question I have is, they were immediately bussed or trucked up onto the Sageri Plateau, so heading up towards Ower's Corner. Now, if you wanted the men to remain available for Milne Bay, it makes more sense for them to be held at Murray Barracks in Port Moresby. One suggestion is that they were taken to the plateau because there's less chance of malaria. Look, it's one of those areas I certainly need to do some more research on, because it's just an interesting to know what was in the mindset of the Australians in terms of the 2nd 27th moving forward. On the 15th of August, the Japanese land more troops, 4,000 men, including 1,800 fighting men. The 2nd 14th and the 2nd 16th, they move forward from Ower's Corner, or actually McDonald's Corner, on the 16th and 17th of August respectively. While this is going on, the 2nd 27th are involved in route marches and firing practice. And on the 17th, this is what goes in their battalion diary. 0900s, air raid, 7-mile drone, which is the main airport there now, Jackson's airstrip. 24 Japanese bombers, Mitsubishi Type 97 with 0 fighter escorts. Details of damage not known. That's there, the KI-21 Mitsubishi Type 97, known as a Gwen or a Sally. They were the heavy bombers. So you can imagine the destruction 24 of those would have done. We do know what actual destruction was done, even though the 2nd 27th didn't. The attack came in around 10 o'clock. 2 rows of planes had been lined up wingtip to wingtip on the edge of the strip. Sidney Rowell had warned the Americans the previous day of the dangers of doing that. 5 supply planes were either destroyed or damaged so badly they couldn't be used, along with 3 B-17 bombers that were fully laden. As a result of this, the 2nd 27th Battalion could not go forward with the sister battalions, the 2nd 14th and the 2nd 16th. Potts moves forward, and he arrives at Myola on the 20th of August, and he's absolutely aghast at the lack of supplies. The number of supplies reported to have been loaded in Port Moresby compared to the ones that actually arrived was quite significant. Just got a short little archival footage, just gives you some idea of how the supplies actually worked. These are C-47s, or as you probably know them, DC-3 Dakotas. And these guys are what you call dispatchers, and they're simply pushing supplies out the cargo door. Much of it would fall into the jungle at Myola. Some of it would plug into the ground and actually just disappear in the bog.
So no parachutes.
Yeah, and in the early stages, there were either no parachutes or the parachutes were very faulty. So on impact, many of the supplies would actually explode and be of no use to anyone. They would often make up to 10 runs across Myola at a height sometimes as low as 20 metres. Unfortunately, a second trip in the day was often too difficult to do. The weather in Kokoda or along the Kokoda Trail is generally good weather in the morning, and it moves in the afternoon, and often rain in the afternoon and into the evening. Meanwhile, the 2nd 27th are continuing with their route marches. One of the interesting notations I found in their diary on the 23rd of August was that they went to church and had a rest that afternoon, but most importantly, they were issued with 1 bottle of beer per man. So you can imagine how they enjoyed that on their Sunday rest. Yeah, one of us Coopers. You can just imagine Jeff Cooper probably telling the men if it wasn't, if it was Tui's or something else, that, you know, they weren't drinking the real thing. Finally, the order is given for the 2nd 27th to move forward. They move forward in 2 groups. This here is a list of some of the equipment that they move forward with. It outlines their dress and equipment. It's interesting that they went forward with, of course, the ubiquitous tin of bully beef. This Frey Benetos is actually the original brand. Well, this label is a copy of the original, and this is a Coles brand bully beef, but it's
Pretty close.
pretty close, as close as we can get. 1 dehydrated emergency ration, 1 chocolate emergency rations. That will become significant when we get to Mission Ridge. Also, we notice the trousers, Khaki Drill. Now, Gary's been kind enough to bring us some Khaki Drill. This is, to me, is a slight mystery about the 2nd 27th Battalion. We know that with the 2nd 14th and the 2nd 16th, when they went forward, they often went forward in the Khaki Drill, but there's reports of them dyeing them green at Myola. The 2nd 27th never got as far as Myola, and yet we have pictures of them in October when they've finally come back off the line in greens. So
some in green, some in khaki.
yeah, so it's one of those ones that needs, again, it needs a little bit more looking into. This is a very important point here. The Vickers guns and the 3-inch mortars will remain as a mobile force at Port Moresby. That becomes extremely significant. It means that their ability to make offensive actions is extremely diminished. They took 50 rounds forward. We'll later find out that yes, they were resupplied with ammunition at Myola. There are 3 36M grenades. I believe they're called Mills bombs, technically.
The first war.
Yeah, Mills bombs. And 10 number 69 grenades. And just a little bit of trivia about those. These 36M grenades, they're actually coated in a shellac, which apparently was to help with moisture, which obviously on the Kokoda Trail would be vitally important. The base plate or the base plug can be removed, and it can be, correct me if I'm wrong, Gary, it can be dispensed, it can actually be fired from a 303 rifle. Yep.
Excuse the pointer. So the base plug you're talking about is right here.
Right on the bottom.
Just there.
And so it can actually be fired. There's a dispensing cup, I don't think that's a technical term.
Discharger cup,
yeah, discharger cup, and that can be fired at the enemy. The 69 grenade is actually made out of Bakelite. It actually has a smaller radius and it's a smaller charge. These are particularly good when you are actually in a position where there's very little cover, because if you throw a 36M and there's no cover, you're in danger of receiving shrapnel back, whereas with the Bakelite, it's less of a chance. And on Mission Ridge, which is an open kunai patch on a ridge, this will become quite significant. Oh, just coming back. You notice down the bottom here, Harry Katakar, Captain, Adjutant, 2nd 27. He's the guy that compiles, obviously, these logistical elements for the unit. I want to tell you a little bit about Harry Katakar, because he will become a very important part of this story. He's born in Mile End in South Australia, 1914, trained as a solicitor, and was starting a law practice when the war broke out. He joined the battalion as a private, and because of his university education, he was commissioned as a lieutenant in Syria, and by the time we get to Kokoda, he is a captain. These are the officers that are part of the 2nd 27th Battalion. Perhaps some of those names may be familiar to you. Captain Keith Viner Smith, the medical officer, he will continue in part of our story. Major Oscar Isaacson, he becomes the commander of the 36th Battalion. They move forward to Uberry, and they actually relieve the 2nd 14th Battalion when they're taken off the line, and they actually continue patrolling on the flanks, as they're not sure what the Japanese are actually intending to do completely. And when we get a bit further into the talk, I'll tell you about the captain in charge of B Company, Arthur Lee, and his military cross action. So as I said, they move forward in two groups. The two groups are essentially divided up in A and B companies, with Battalion Headquarters become known as Cooper Force. They move forward with their commanding officer, Jeffery Cooper. White Force, which is under Major White, is C, D and Headquarters Company. Like we do when we're walking in a trekking group on Kokoda, everyone moves in a sense at their own pace. And you'll read through their Battalion Diaries that the men are stopping at different places, bivouacking for nights in different situations as they move forward. One of the points of interest though is on the 3rd of September, as they are approaching a Foggy, they are confronted by men walking wounded from the 2nd 14th and the 2nd 16th coming towards them. And the diary entry says, morale of wounded, but more particularly in the case of the 53rd Battalion men, was very low. Are you guys familiar with some of the history? I imagine you are, of the 53rd Battalion. They're often referred to as that mob. They were fighting on the eastern side of the Eora Valley, Creek Valley, while the Battle of Isharava is being conducted. And probably in most part due to lack of good leadership, some of these men were, I guess, like little lost sheep, not knowing exactly what to do. Many of the men actually fought very well, but there was definitely a sense that morale was low. They knew they'd been relieved. At Myola, they'd been told to hand over their automatic weapons, and they were moving off the line. Yeah, they were moving off like a beaten force. They received information that the 21st Brigade was at Myola. Now that's an interesting comment, because when they started the track, they actually had no idea exactly where the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th were. They had some clues, but the messages are coming back in dribs and drabs. So they finally know where the 21st Brigade are headquartered. Many stretcher cases are starting to come in, and once again it says in the entry, 1600, heavy rain begins to fall. That is just so typical of Kokoda. You can almost set your watch by it. On the 4th of September, Jellicoe. What's Jellicoe? Until very recently, I didn't know what it was either. Jellicoe is in fact the code word used by the 21st Brigade. They chose words that were difficult for the Japanese to repeat. At Ishirawa and at other places, the Japanese would mimic the Australians, saying things like, "You there, cobber? You there, cobber?" hoping the Australians would show themselves. So Jellicoe becomes the recognition word between the troops on the 4th of September. On the 4th of September, A and B Company arrived to take over defence from the 39th Battalion. The 39th Battalion are now down to 185 men of their original battalion strength. 40 have been killed in action, 70 wounded in action, plus those that have been evacuated due to illness. Orders at this time come in, and we might get you, Gary, to do our pointer here. The orders come in that they are to send one company, which will be B Company, from Khaki, so down here on the bottom there, yep, and they are to go over the pre-war mail route, over Mount Bellamy to Templetons Crossing, which is right at the top there, over there. And the idea is that they are to come in, and if the Japanese are crossing at that point, they are to harass them and slow them down to relieve pressure on the 2nd 14th. If they have passed, they are told to come in behind them, and the 2nd 14th, who are actually holding between Myola, down on the bottom right there, Gary, in that Ford tri-motor, here, down in there, sort of a bit below, sorry the map doesn't show it, between there and Templetons Crossing. A Company are told to go on the main track, and they're told to go that night to relieve pressure on 21st Brigade and the rest of the battalions. An hour and 15 minutes later, that order is rescinded. The situation has changed so dramatically, Potts realises that he cannot hold Myola. It is a wide open space, the flanks are just too difficult to defend. Native police are sent out after A Company, but they can't be located. You'll see that there's tracks crossing everywhere. These only give a small indication of the number of tracks that are there. They literally are, you know, the local boys, I've done the track, now 12 times, Gary's done it 20, and they still have to point us in the right direction at times because it's so confusing. The 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th are very heavily pressed by superior numbers of enemy. The intention at that point is to withdraw past Khaki, coming back to Khaki, and to move through what was wartime a Foggy, which you can't see on the map. Hopefully I'll get another shot for you.
Are you getting this, Seamus, with the sword? You've got that? Yeah.
and they are to dig in south of a Foggy. And so it becomes known as the Battle of a Foggy South, or as we know it, Mission Ridge and Brigade Hill. Troops are issued with extra ammunition. Native carriers arrive from Myola with extra ammunition and extra food. And it says in the Brigade Diary that 95% of supplies were either removed, buried or destroyed. Now this here, Gary's found at Myola, and it's a tin of what?
I'd possibly say salmon, maybe.
Perhaps salmon. And it's actually got,
Yeah, you can pick that up.
It's actually got bayonet marks in it. So the Australians have actually stabbed this to make it go off. And by the time the Battle of Foggy South is going on, the Japanese are starting to complain of dysentery, and it's starting to go through the men. And this was perhaps a factor, and in fact one of the commanding officers of the Japanese told his men just not eat the rich Australian food.
The important thing about that tin, if I can just jump in, as Adrian's pointed out, there's the bayonet marks at the top of the lid, but you can see the bottom of the tin has been opened with a can opener. So it's highly likely, I believe, from the position where we found this tin on Myola, that again this was penetrated or punctured by the Australians and opened by the Japanese, consumed, which has brought on dysentery.
Could have been baked beans too, mate.
Yeah, it could have been baked beans. Should I get at your place when I come over for a breakfast?
No, it's Navy supplies, not wanted.
So, remember I said they moved forward in two groups? On the 4th of September, White Force is back at Narrow. And this is from Jeff Reading. He was the correspondent for the Daily Mirror in Sydney. And he says, Some urgently needed medical supplies were dropped by parachutes, but more than half failed to open and the contents smashed. Occasionally, a food package burst with the impact of landing, and biscuits, tins, dried fruit or flour went flying in all directions. Now you sort of think, oh, well, what does that... We can understand that you lose supplies, but it sometimes can be far more significant than that. On the 4th of September, the men at Narrow were sheltering in native huts, and they weren't warned of a supply drop. 4 men were injured, 1 seriously, 1 man was killed. His name was Private Patrick John Dinan, and he's buried at Bamana War Cemetery. The unfortunate reality of war. I would imagine that the code word for this particular day was from someone in the 2nd 14th Battalion, a Victorian battalion. Perhaps possibly a South Australian, maybe, who knows. But it certainly wouldn't have been very popular with any Carlton supporters or probably any other supporters of any AFL teams. I have to jump. This here is taken from one of the original maps drawn by, I imagine, their intelligence section, and it's outlining the positions on Brigade Hill. This probably gives a little bit clearer perspective. Now, I might actually come over.
Can you be trusted with this?
Yeah, I hope so. Okay, so when you walk the track now, Mission Ridge is no longer part of the track. You continue down through this way. The Japanese will eventually come up this way. This is the position where the 2nd 27th first dig in. They will eventually be moved back 800 yards to this position here. Headquarters is set up back here. 2nd 14th behind the 2nd 27th on some of this high country, and the 2nd 16th, which are guarding an emergency escape route off the side to the southwest.
Can you just explain the hill, how they flow on that map?
As in along Mission Ridge, so it drops down steeply on either side. So where the track comes up, it drops away. As you come up through this section here, though, it's not, it's probably not as steep as in other positions. The flanks were far more exposed in this position, and which was part of the reason of bringing them back, but also to compress the Australian positions through that time. Actually, I might get you to point out as we go. Excuse me for showing you my back. So early on the morning of the 5th of September, the 39th Battalion, they actually move from Khaki through a Foggy. Yep, coming down. The A and B companies, which have been finally found, they come down, follow them down with as many supplies as they can. And in fact, it is the 39th Battalion that first dig in those 2nd 27th positions. They are to hold that position until the 2nd 27th are in place. The second part, the White Force, they've actually come from Inari, which is on the other side of headquarters, Brigade Headquarters. They've come up, they've come all the way through to a Foggy. They've taken supplies and they've come back to where the 2nd 27th were first positioned. And so once the 2nd 27th were all together, it was about 2 o'clock on the afternoon of the 5th. Part of the 39th Battalion had also been guarding the track towards Myola. They then came through, and it is only when they are finally back together with the rest of the 39th Battalion that they are relieved. They hand over their automatic weapons, their Bren guns and their ammunition, and they continue off. They are relieved off the line, they proceed back through all these positions down to Inari, where you may have remember the famous Inari parade that was filmed by Damien Parra, those ragged bloody heroes, where they're finally relieved, and Ralph Honour speaks to them. So in terms of the story, the 39th, their fight has been done for a time. And the 2nd 27th, they establish that position. Later in the afternoon, 21st Brigade Headquarters, so Potts comes through and heads towards his headquarters position. And then that night, the 2nd 14th and the 2nd 16th actually sleep at a Foggy. A Foggy, wartime a Foggy, which is different to modern, was actually on a horseshoe bend in the Foggy River. And Doc Vernon from the 39th, he said it was one of the most dispiriting places. It is so steep. The sides of those hills are just, unless you've seen them, it's hard to describe just how steep they really are.
Yeah, those contour lines don't do this justice.
Now, I'm just very much aware of the time. One of the things that I recently picked up, when I walked the track, I got my GPS out and I measured the distance. In one of the history books, it said that it's 1.2 kilometres from headquarters through to the second position of the 2nd 27th. So on the afternoon, of the 5th, Potts comes along and he actually gets them to move back.
Sorry, so it's moved from there to there.
Yeah, so 800 metres they move back. But one of the history books says that from headquarters to the rear position of where the 2nd 27th was 1.2 kilometres. Well, I can tell you it's not. It's at least 1.8, possibly even 1.9. Now, even if you take the dog leg, the curve out, it is still quite a distance. And you'll see there marked, there's a mortar position. Now, this map, the scale of this map is skew if because it is only 400 metres from headquarters to that mortar position. Now, when the battle actually starts, if they're firing rounds from that 3-inch mortar position, a 3-inch mortar, a standard 3-inch mortar, will have a maximum range of 1.5 kilometres. If that's the case, they are literally landing the rounds right on top of the 2nd 27th. Now, it's possible that they had the long-range version of the 3-inch mortar. They did come in 1942. But for the Australians to receive those new weapons, which would have had to come from England, then to be supplied, placed on the ships and sent to Papua New Guinea, I think it's extremely unlikely. And I'll tell you in a moment what actually I believe happens. When they get into position there, you can imagine the comments from the 2nd 14th and the 2nd 16th to the boys from the 27th Battalion. Better late than never. It's good of you to turn up. Thanks for coming. We could have done with you last week. They move through, and it says that mail arrived for the first time in about 5 weeks. Men hastily scribbled down whatever they could and sent replies, and the mail was taken back out. The night of the 5th and the 6th, they spent some fairly cheerless nights in waterlogged weapons pits. The 2nd 27th are dug in a tight diamond-shaped formation. A company is there, as you can see, on the right at the front, B beside them, C, D, and with headquarters in the middle. That open expanse in front of them is kunai grass. Firing lanes were cut through the kunai grass in order to see the approaching Japanese. On the night of the 6th of September, it's what they call the Japanese Lantern Parade. The Japanese were coming down with some with lanterns, but some they would believe they were actually burning signal wire or the rubber on the outside of Australian signal wire as they were coming down. Occasionally an observer would see a light tumble as they slipped and fell. If you've walked the track, you know how easily that can happen. They watched through the night as they were coming down, and the Japanese obviously realised that the Australians had absolutely nothing in which to fire back. But there was no Vickers, Mortars wouldn't reach that far, there was no artillery. And one of the guys, Roy Watson, describes the Japanese as conceited bastards. Another guy, Slim Little, his nickname, from the 2nd 27th, he says, the night we dug in a Foggy, I'll never forget that night as long as I live. We dug in a bit of open kunai grass, and we dug a hole with a bayonet and a helmet, and that's where we slept the night. And coming down the other hill towards the river were the Japs, hordes of Japs. We had to sit there watching them come up. It was pretty nerve-wracking. Knowing the situation, Brigadier Potts has called for an airstrike for the following morning. Cynthia. At around 8 o'clock in the morning, 8:15 if you believe, depending on which diary you read, 8 B-26 Marauders come through and drop 50 bombs along the section of the track heading from a Foggy all the way back through to Khaki and north a Foggy where the Japanese are coming through. At 10:30, some P-39s, Airacobras come through and they strafe that area, and in fact they strafe closer to the forward defensive lines of the Australians. As a result of that, the Japanese refer to that area as Hell Valley or the Valley of Death. The Japanese received a large number of casualties. I can't tell you exactly how many. That's an area where some more research is actually needed. You can imagine the Australians cheering. Finally, the Japanese are getting a bit of their own back. Up until now, the Japanese have had their mountain guns and their mortars and have been pounding the Australians. Finally, yeah, as I say, the Japanese are getting their own back. At about 8:30 on that morning, they see 12 Japanese and they actually come to the little hut. That's something I didn't mention. They call it Mission Ridge because there was a Seventh-day Adventist mission hut right in the middle of the open area. They see 12 Japanese come there and they appear to be setting up a mortar, or most likely a Type 92 mountain gun. When the Australians fire, they give up and they return. The Japanese then start to range their mortars and their field guns, which possibly is the start of the Type 94, they're bigger, they're 75mm mountain guns. They cut the signal wire to C Company, and Captain Johnson, in charge of C Company, is injured with a head wound. Lex Macaulay says that the artillery was so close that the Australians didn't hear the sound of the incoming rounds before the explosion. So it gives you some idea of how close the Japanese actually must have been. A Company, they call for mortar support. And that's where this message I've just found recently, it says, Moors on way down. Because I believe that message indicates that they could not shoot over the top of the Australians, and so they needed to move the mortars closer. The mortars were made up of a composite group from all 3 battalions, and it was led by Lieutenant Schwind from the 2nd 14th. He found himself a position and he was able to return fire on the Japanese. The Japanese, however, returned fire with a mountain gun and men were injured. They quickly worked out a good system where they would fire several rounds from the mortars and then they would retreat to a safe place, wait for the Japanese to fire their mountain guns, and fortunately their mortar was never hit, and so that system continued to work. Schwind watched one Japanese officer who was standing out in the middle and a round actually hit him in the head, and he said that peculiar stupidity which went parallel with their cunning. I thought that was quite interesting. The peculiar stupidity which went parallel with their cunning. During the afternoon, patrols are sent out. It's interesting here, C Company actually go out, and it says they go out with snipers. One of the things that I found on reading through the battalion history is that when they arrived in Port Moresby, they were issued with 18 sniper rifles, and they were to take 12 of them forward, or keep 6 themselves and take 12 forward to give to the 2nd 14th and the 2nd 16th. And that's one of the first references I've found to snipers on the Australian side. Bit of trivia, the 2nd 16th and the 2nd 27th had a shooting competition back in Australia, a sniper competition, and the 2nd 27th they won 505 points to 487, so they were the better shots. In the afternoon of the 7th, Sergeant Johns from A Company. A Company is the side that is getting pounded the most. He goes out on a patrol and kills 6 Japanese and is awarded the military medal. Lieutenant Hewitt from 18 Platoon, he goes out and he comes back with something that's probably even more valuable. He came back with 11 Arnott's tins full of water. Because of the position where it is, you cannot begin to imagine how hot Mission Ridge can be. When the sun belts down on that open area, it is intense. And so water becomes a major issue, as does ammunition and food. Yeah, I'm just seeing the clock tick here.
You're up to 40 minutes.
Yeah, I'm fast running out of time. I have to compress some of that. Some of this information about the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th is so important that it really is a lecture in itself. What they're doing while the 2nd 27th are in this situation, is very important. So what I'll try to do is I'll try to synthesise it as much as I can. We move. Where are we? Okay, so during that night, the Japanese do what the Australians have known that they do, is they move out in flanking movements. However, having walked that track, on that western side of the track, it is some of the steepest country you can begin to imagine. It's almost like cliffs in places. It is so steep. I can understand why Brigadier Potts did not believe that the Japanese would go that way. So the 2nd Battalion of the 144th Regiment, if you've heard of a guy called Kokichi Nishimura, the bone man of Kokoda, he was part of that battalion. And they've come up and they've infiltrated the Australian positions. They've infiltrated the knoll right on the top of Brigade Hill and either side. Brigadier Potts is now cut off.
He's here.
The start of the morning, Brigadier Potts and Lance Corporal John Gill go to the latrine. A sniper shoots and kills John Gill. They are now in serious problems because all the ammunition, spare ammunition, all the food reserves are behind the Australian positions. Now, I am going to skip the fighting attempts to regain the lines. Throughout that day, Potts sends out messages backwards and forwards. They form up a line, an extended line, the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th, and they move in an attempt to get through to Potts. Only a small number of men manage to make it through, and then Potts asks for volunteers, well, it basically says we need guys to go forward. Captain Langridge from the 2nd 16th, he leads a group of men and is killed. Most of the men are hit with withering fire by snipers, machine guns, grenades as they attempt to move. As a result, they now have more wounded. The lull in the afternoon, well, during the morning, A Company of the 2nd 27th is hit again and again and again. Throughout the day, they will lose 6 Bren guns. They will use 1,200 grenades. They will also use the reserves in an attempt to keep the Japanese at bay. At about 1 o'clock, Jeff Cooper realises there's a lull in the fighting and he makes the decision at that point to withdraw. Following that, the attempt is made to clear the line and that's unsuccessful. So late in the afternoon, this is where the story of Captain Lee comes into place. They made some short, sharp bayonet thrusts at the enemy in an attempt to drive them back, and Captain Lee from B Company and Captain Skipper, they made a counter-attack. And this is what he says. He was heard to yell, they're getting all the young chaps. We old buggers have something to account for. Come on, boys, give the bastards a full mag. And he and 2 soldiers then charged the advancing Japanese. The Japanese were so shocked that they actually began to withdraw. The irony of that comment was Captain Lee was 30 years of age. I would love to be an old bugger. I'm sure there'd be plenty here that would agree. As a result of that action, Captain Lee receives a bar to his military cross, and Captain Skipper is mentioned in dispatches. As a result of these engagements on Brigade Hill, the 2nd 27th have 39 killed in action, 2 missing in action and 45 wounded. The escape route is where the men of the 2nd 14th, 2nd 16th and 2nd 27th now go. They're led by a man from the 2nd 27th, Lieutenant Hewitt. He leads the men, and they're very slow going because they have about 15 stretcher cases.
Can I just jump in for 1 second? So the main Kokoda Trail is going in that direction. A lot of this is virgin jungle, and there was a track of sorts roughly cut by Bert Kenzel the day before. But a lot of this is virgin jungle. So you've been to Kokoda, and you know how hard it is to go along a track. So when you're going through raw jungle, very difficult. Sorry, Mike.
No, you're right. Absolutely. So they're making slow going, and at about 9 o'clock, the rain is misting down again, and they decide to bivouac for the night. They say that about 30% of the men were on guard duty that night, but there was no contact by the Japanese. Now, from here, the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th, they move quickly down this track to Inari, and they are able to get relief there. They wait until 2:45 in the afternoon, hoping that the 2nd 27th will get there. But the 2nd 27th have the stretcher cases, and so they're unable to make it there. The 2nd 27th are now cut off behind enemy lines. They get close to Inari and realise there's no way they can go in, and so Cooper makes the decision to run parallel to the track. He sticks to the high country because the top of the ridges are always clearer in any bush, and they continue to make their way along. These are the stretcher cases. One of the Australians comes from Inari he starts with 100 native carriers and he arrives with 70. 30 have deserted along the way, and this relieves some of the carrying. This is where we come back to Captain Henry Katakar. Now I'm sorry, I've got to sort of compress it all, but over the next days, you can imagine with the little amount of food that these men have, how hungry they become. The carriers complain because they haven't eaten for 3 or 4 days, and so they find a native garden and they're able to cook some taro and yams. And this is what he says: "The wounded, God only knows, were in purgatory, hungry and in great pain. Some of the natives began to desert, meaning that our men had to replace them as bearers. Doc Viner Smith allowed the maggots to remain in the wounds in order to eat the rotting flesh and so prevent gangrene. One chap had one straight through the throat and kept asking for water. And as she kept giving him the water, much of it ran straight out again. He didn't last. One day I thought, he looks better, then he was gone." This is now the 15th of September. So we're now 6 days after the battle. They got as far as Narrow, and when they got to Narrow, they headed to Murat Narrow believing that it was deserted. When they got to within 800 yards, they realised that the Japanese had enforced it. And so you can imagine the feeling of having to turn around and literally go back to where you'd started on that previous day. And he says by this time the men were desperately exhausted. A couple of providential incidents occurred that day. While we were waiting outside Narrow, it suddenly occurred to me that a lot of the food had been dropped by our planes would be scattered far and wide. Remember the footage of the film? The cargo going everywhere. I wandered off into the jungle in search of food. Something must have led me to a spot. After a while I noticed a branch had been broken off. And I looked down and saw a bag-covered bundle. Almost tenderly I went down my knees to tear away some of the bag. In it was a perfectly good tin of Arnott's Army biscuits. Now my good old mum has made some Army biscuits from the original recipe. If you want to snap off a bit, if you've got dentures, I wouldn't advise it.
I was going to walk around now, but we'll leave it up to you guys to come back. And again, made from the original wartime recipe. Yeah.
And a flank guard patrol found a 25-pound tin of Crow and Newcomb's dried apricots. So there we go. So that was at least some relief. On the 22nd of September, this is the men after they've finally regained the Australian lines. You can look how thin they are. The average man lost 12.7 kilograms. There they are lining up to finally have a feed. But the story doesn't quite end there. Yes, Harry Katakar is mentioned in dispatches for his involvement, for his ability to help organise the carrying of the men. But there's still the stretcher cases. They're left with D Company, and in fact they've been left behind with 10 men who are led by Corporal John Burns. You may have heard of John Burns, and a guy called Alf Zanker. And they were there to look after. And the idea was that they would wait for help to come back. At one point towards the end of this story, they hear a noise in the jungle. They don't know if it's an Australian patrol rescuing or if it's Japanese. Alf Zanker, he leads the walking wounded. There's 9 walking wounded off into the jungle. John Burns stands beside the stretcher cases of the 6 men. Now, on the plinths at Isharaba, there are 4 words: courage, endurance, mateship, and sacrifice. I think John Burns typifies all of those things. You know, the courage to stand there. I don't know what I would have done. The endurance of what they did. These men finally, the good news is the noise in the jungle were Australians. They are finally rescued, and they arrive back on the Australian lines on the 9th of October. It is literally a month after the Battle of Brigade Hill and Mission Ridge has ended. A month. So you imagine how much weight. Well, look, John Burns actually looks like he's been in a pretty good pasture there. So I'd say he's recovered quite well.
That's definitely not 45.
What I simply want to say, just in conclusion, is that throughout this time that the 2nd 27th were behind enemy lines, they did not discard weapons and they maintained good military discipline. This was in no small part to Harry Katakar's involvement and Jeff Cooper. The 2nd 27th did not concede ground. Their withdrawal was the result of actions that happened elsewhere on the hill that day. When they did finally move, they brought all their wounded, all their weapons and equipment, and forced the Japanese to break contact. One significant factor that I'll end on is that as a result of them being behind enemy lines with their weapons, the Japanese were forced to leave a battalion at Narrow, which meant when they went on to Irabaira, which was as far as the Japanese got, it meant that there was one battalion that they couldn't throw against the Australians. So that effort by the 2nd 27th, I think, is remarkable. Their motto is Primus inter pares, first among equals. Thank you very much.
I want to point out a couple of things, folks, for those who didn't hear the conversation beforehand. So Adrian explained that on the 8th of September, the 2nd 27th had lost 6 of their prized Bren guns. I've walked the trail a number of times. Only once, I should get rid of that, it's not good for the public. Only once have I walked across the trail when Mission Ridge itself, the battlefield of Mission Ridge, had been cleared by the local landowner for farming purposes, obviously an attempt to see whether he could farm. So he'd burnt all the undergrowth, all the kunai, and as a result, the ridge line was bare. So having said that, 19 times I've walked the trail, it's covered in jungle, you can't see a thing, but this one time that he actually, have you got that grenade photo there? The one time that he has burnt this patch, the whole place was just littered with refuse. Now I'm not one to go and rape a battlefield, I don't just go and pluck things for the sake of it, but of those 6 Bren guns which were lost on the 7th, this is, we ask you not to touch them, just have a good look, but please don't touch, they're very fragile. That's a butt plate from a Mark 1 Bren. That's a Bren gun magazine, as you can see. And this is a bolt from a SMLE, or a short magazine Landfield No. 1 Mark III rifle. Interestingly, it's a First World War bolt head. So no doubt a surplus weapon from the First War, reissued during the Second War. And of course that was a tin. And this here is the foot. I'll just pick that one up, it's quite small. It's a foot of a Bren gun bipod. So again, all these things litter the battlefield. You were there in 1979, there would have been far more stuff there, but as you saw with the jungle, it's just impossible to find unless there's been a fire go through there. So again, just have a bit of a look at them. I mean, they are from Mission Ridge, those pieces there. Except for the tin's from Morola, I should say.
We've got some time for questions. Is there anyone who'd like to ask any questions?
And with the questions, I'm very much the apprentice This is my Jedi Master here, so if I can't answer, I'll tell him.
Actually, can I just jump in on this, if you can? Adrian and we run a non-profit organisation called Medals Gone Missing. There's a few people who do this, but we essentially get war medals back to the families when they turn up on eBay through deceased estates or get lost or stolen otherwise. In 1975, Harry Katakar returned to his native Renmark in South Australia, and after his retirement, of course. And in 1975, his medals were stolen in a break and enter. So he was awarded 6 medals: the 3945 Star, the Pacific Star, the Defence Medal, War Medal, the Service Medal. So his medals were stolen, and I found them on eBay about 26 years later. Of course, Harry unfortunately had gone to heaven by that stage, so we purchased the medals. It took us some months to find his family. I got on to his daughters, and his sister was still alive. His sister Helen very much loved her brother. As a result of that, we were on the next plane down to South Australia. We returned Harry's medals after 25 years, and the girls recognised their mother's hand in the stitching. She had stitched these medals. They were swing mounted, so that was a really nice thing for us. Probably one of our highlights, I think, in Medals Gone Missing. But these tags here, I'll hand over to you for them.
Okay, well, this is Hubert Ian Manser. He was, I believe, attached to the headquarters company as a stretcher bearer, and he was recommended for a Distinguished Conduct Medal for rescuing several men under fire on the 7th. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, on the 7th of, so as the Battle of Mission Ridge is commencing, and these are the original identification tags.
Indeed.
Of Hubert Manser, and well, I think I deserve a medal because I helped to create that young guy on the right-hand side.
That's his son, who looks a bit cleaner than him. Indeed. Of significance, we found again his dog tags on eBay. I think $140 or something they end up going for, but we actually bought the dog tags. So there's 2 metal tags and there's 2 fibre tags, that compressed asbestos fibre. Of course, all have his name on there. But of really great interest is this little key. Do you recognise the key? Some of you older blokes, here I said older blokes, so you're more than 30 years of age. The key, the sausage bag, the kit bag that you all had, yeah? And it had a number of loops, brass loops through the top, and you'd thread a D-shaped handle through loops and close the D-shape and then lock it up. So that's the key to his kit bag, which I found fascinating. So of course we're returning it. We've made contact with Manser's family, and we will return the dog tags. They said once we finish doing our Kokoda treks. But again, I mean, this man, if DNA is part of this story, his DNA would be in that leather fob. So I would suggest at least the metal tags were on Mission Ridge through September of 1942, possibly even the fibre tags, because I mean they were virtually indestructible, the fibre tags. So so they're dog tags which were on Mission Ridge, we believe, in September of 1942 during the fighting. And as Adrian pointed out, one of his corporals, one of his fellow troopers, was stuck out in no man's land, a bloke named Maxwell Doodle, and he was crying out in pain, and it was impossible to get out to him, to pull him back. Any stretcher bearers would have been shot and killed. So Manser, on 2 occasions, ventured out into no man's land, the first time to check his wounds, the second time to administer morphine. And as a result, he couldn't save his mate, but he could reduce his pain, and as a result of that, I get a chill when I tell stories such as that, because again, that's just, the courage, endurance, mateship, sacrifice. I mean, that is self-sacrifice in a way. So anyway, off the point. Is there any questions of Adrian? Ask him a really curly one if you can, please. Young lady up the back, you got a question there?
She's got a number of questions, I'm sure.
So apart from the president here, who else has walked the trail? Okay, a few have done it? Yeah? So what year, how long ago was this?
2005.
2005, okay. And tourism now compared to, well, it's 1979?
No, 98.
Oh, 98.
I'm not that old.
I mean, certainly the trail has expanded in terms of tourism, but there is a bit of a plateau happening now, I think.
It's sort of kind of a steady market now. It peaked, about 2008, 2009?
Yeah, right.
And then it's tailed off to some degree. But look, a lot of the historians who write about it have never walked it. And look, there's no doubt you can do incredible things with research, but when you walk the track, it does bring up questions that I just can't see that you would necessarily get by just research alone.
Well, to emphasise that point too, if I can, you've walked the trail, you guys. In a book, in a history book, Blood 9, for example, it would say I walked from here or from here to there. During the Battle of Brigade Hill, there was what 38 men or 37 men left out of battle in Inari, and towards the end of the battle, before say Potts could withdraw, these men went from Inari back up to Brigade Hill. Now that's one sentence in a book. Yeah, we went from here to there. But you know how hard it is. Those hills are just phenomenal. So it really is mind-boggling. Until you walk the track and see the hills, experience the hills yourself, you know, these throwaway lines in the book really just do not do it justice.
One of the ones that really demonstrates that is A Company of the 2nd 27th. They spent the first night at Irabiwa. Now, when we do a trek, we do from Owers Corner to Irabiwa, you know, semi-regularly. It is a big day, like it is a huge day. You'll have trekkers sometimes coming in after dark. These guys would have started from McDonald's Corner, which is a 4-hour march further towards Port Moresby. So again, when you read something like that and you've walked the track, you can get an appreciation for, you know, how much these guys were going forward to help their sister battalions. You know, they weren't mucking around, they were moving forward as fast as they could.
I imagine you've been able to talk to some of the survivors of the battle along the line. There can't be many left. 2nd 27th, gee, have you been able to actually get verbal history from some of these people?
To be honest, I've spoken to a few veterans. Unfortunately for me, my background in history was actually medieval English history. I've actually come to military history, Australian military history, probably a little bit later than some. This is my 50th year. I've probably been at it now for coming on to 10 years, but I've missed a lot of the veterans because a lot of the veterans have passed. I've listened to a lot of their interviews and you can pick up a lot of very good information, but I think Gary's probably spoken to a few more.
Look, I'm from Moruya on the south coast, and our area of recruiting, the battalion associated with that was the 3rd Militia Battalion, the 3rd Battalion, which is the longest continuous serving battalion on the Kokoda Trail. But again, they were the Chocos, they were militia fellas. And our last veteran passed away about 3 years ago. But his platoon sergeant was Captain B. Tongs, well, captain in later life, Sergeant B. Tongs during 1942. Have you heard of B. Tongs at all? Yeah, Bede is one of those veterans who would speak about it, and he was there. So there was no BS about it. People often say the veterans who talk about it were the ones who weren't there, the rear echelon blokes. Well, every man's part of a team, so it doesn't matter whether you're rear echelon or front echelon. But yeah, blokes like that, B. Tongs and Owen Basket was the gentleman from Moruya who was our last veteran. I had a lot to do with those guys there, and it really is a crying shame for our nation that these men are dying. I mean, they are all national treasures, and the women who support them when they got home as well. Owen spent his whole life going to psychologists because he got carried out of Templetons Crossing. But there was one action there where he was talking about grenades. Adrian was talking about grenades. Well, Bede crawled up a fire lane, lobbed 2 grenades into a Japanese weapons pit because the Japanese were making the mistake of looking out to their left and not looking to the front. Wearing his helmet, he said he buried his head into the mud, his whole face, and his helmet was in the mud to try and give him some protection from the blast, and he got out and they charged forward. Well, Owen Basket said to me that action of crawling forward and throwing those 2 grenades saved a lot of lives. So yeah, it was a real privilege to speak to some of them. As he said, we've missed the boat now. We should have done this 20, 30 years ago.
Can I just make a point, please? Look, I'm an old sailor, but I just commend you both for what you've been able to get into an hour. 3 decades ago, I used to listen to a guy called Major General Paul Cullen.
Oh, well, okay.
Long departed. Paul never got to the battle, the action. He got lost in the detail and the lead up to it, and all the sort of peripherals. I'm being a little unkind to the poor man, but at the same time, he was just fascinating to listen to.
But look, the privilege with us is if I say this comment, it'll mean something to you. It means nothing to my children. But you remember men walking down the street with the clinking of swing-mounted medals. Yeah, First World War veterans, Second World War veterans all had swinging medals. Yeah, clink, clink, clink as they marched. Now all the veterans have court-mounted medals. It's just a whole different era. So again, it's a crying shame they've all left us. But yeah, it was truly a privilege to know those men from the 3rd Battalion. 3rd Battalion was my battalion in terms of the men I interacted with. I was 4th 3 Regiment in Canberra. So
We were lucky enough on the track to actually meet a couple of Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels.
Yeah.
I think the last one died in 2015.
Yeah, Ovram and Dicky. Yeah, and he was a gun boy, they say, so as opposed to a carrier. But
and we were at what they call Fuzzy Wuzzy Day in Kokoda, and they actually flew, and I think there was 9 veterans at that stage. Bede Tongs was one of those. And I think Owen Baskin.
And Owen was there, yeah.
So we're able to. So there was those kind of opportunities, but yeah, unfortunately,
yeah.
passed. Yeah. One of the amazing characters of this particular battle from the 2nd 16th, Bill Graydon, was a lieutenant, I believe in C Company. He was on the eastern side of that attempt to break through back to headquarters. He made it through with 8 or 9 men, and then when Potts called for men from headquarters company to go back, Bill Graydon went back and he made it back through. He survived the war. He had 10 children, well, his wife had 10 children. He contributed, I'm sure. And he became a member of Parliament, and he's alive at 98. I checked just before I finished this